Hello, my name is Faruk Mardan. I am a lecturer in translation and technology at the University of Leeds. At the same time, I am also a freelance translator and interpreter working with English, Chinese, and my native language, Uyghur. Um, it's a huge honor for me to speak at the WorldView conference. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to really talk to business owners, entrepreneurs from my personal perspective as an academic, but also as a practitioner in the language service industry. Today, I want to talk to you about how to use the right type of translation services for your business to maximize your sales and your market presence. To begin with, I want to offer you a terminology buster. Because there are lots of terms being thrown around in the language service industry. For example, there is translation. You must have heard of translation, of course. There is interpreting. There is localization. There is subtitling. And there are many, many other terms being used in the translation industry. It's important for you to understand the differences between these terms to really know what type of service that you are after. So let's begin with translation. Translation is the broadest term when it comes to transmitting from one language to another. But in the narrowest sense, translation is the transfer of a written text from one language to another. So, for example, you must have read maybe a novel from, originally written in a foreign language, like Don Quixote is written in Spanish. You must have you probably have read the English version. This is typically a translation, as we call it. And of course, translation is not only applied in literary text. Translation can be seen everywhere in all sorts of texts, in technical texts, in marketing, in games, in news, and whatnot. So, like I said, in the narrowest sense, translation is transferring written text from one language to another. And then you have interpreting. You must have attended an international conference where, for example, a speaker from a different country is speaking in their own native language. Of course, you cannot expect everybody to speak English because not everybody is an English native speaker and their command of English is very different. I myself is not an English native speaker, so I really appreciate this. People can best express themselves when they're speaking in their native language. That's why we have professional interpreters working from their language into a language that you understand. For example, English. Let's say you're attending a conference and then there is a speaker speaking in Japanese, and then there is an interpreter working in the booth behind you, probably. They're working from Japanese into English to make sure that you understand what they're talking about. So the speaker can focus on expressing themselves in the best way possible, and then you will have no problem understanding the speaker because the interpreter is at your service. And of course, there are different types of interpreting services. There is simultaneous interpreting. In the example I mentioned earlier, when the interpreter is only lagging about a few seconds behind and delivering the speech almost simultaneously, and you're listening from a headpiece, then this is called simultaneous interpreting. But sometimes in a very small scale business meeting, for example, you might rely on consecutive interpreting. And also, for example, in a typical setting when heads of states meet each other and when they don't speak the same language, you will find interpreting sitting behind them, taking notes. So this is called consecutive interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is a form of interpreting where the speaker will speak maybe a chunk of sense or maybe a paragraph or for a few minutes, depending on the situation. The interpreter takes notes in the meantime, and then the speaker pauses for the interpreter to translate or interpret, as we call it, the content of the speech. Normally, in layperson term, this is referred to as translation as well, but technically speaking, this is different, and this should be strictly called interpreting. So, in a to put it simply, interpreting is the translation of spoken words rather than written text. And then there's, of course, localization. Localization is very similar to translation, but with much more nuances. So when you're translating from one language to another, maybe you're translating for a specific purpose. Now, very rarely does a translator translate a text on a piece of paper using pens. Everybody uses a computer now. But of course, there are even more specific purposes for translation. For example, you might be translating an in-game text for a video game, or you might be translating a website. So you would have to consider not only the written text, but also how the text is displayed, the typeface, the size, the font, and these are all part of the localization process that you have to consider. Imagine that you are translating from, say, Italian or French to English. Usually, Italian and French are much more verbose than English. English is a more precise more concise language. Sorry. So the same text would take a much smaller space in English than in French and Italian, for example. So you would have to consider how much space this text occupies on your website, and even on your mobile version. You have to consider how the text is displayed on a mobile phone, on a smartphone. You would also have to think about the codes. For example, you might have to consider Unicode when you're translating into languages such as Arabic and Chinese. You would have to consider the fact that the Arabic script is written from right to left. These are all part of the localization processes. Another example of localization consideration is, for example, the format of date and time. Even say you are promoting your product in the US market as a UK business, you would have to still think about different words that you have to use in the US. For example, truck versus lorry, or pavement versus sidewalk, etc., etc. And you also have to consider how the date is presented in the UK format and the US format, because they work differently. And for example, you have to consider the decimal point in the EU countries. The decimal point is a comma rather than a dot. So these are all part of the localization processes. And then you have to think about, for example, the cultural sensitivity in your content, whether your content run the risk of offending the consumers in your target market. This is the least you want. This is the worst thing that could happen. You might end up offending the target audience, and then this could be a huge backlash. We can see numerous examples of this happening in other countries. For example, countries in the Middle East and countries such as China and Japan. So you can find a lot of examples like this. So localization, to put simply, is translation, but it's much more than translation. So understanding the right type of translation service, language service, is really important. Let's use translation as an example. So you might require different levels of quality for your translation services. Let me explain this in a much simpler term. Let's say you have a text that requires translation, but this text is not to be published. This text needs translation because you want your partners in other countries to understand what's going on. This might be a piece of text just to inform your business partners in France, in China, in Japan, and in Senegal or Malaysia. So you would have to translate the English text into all these different languages, but this is never meant to be published. Then probably you can probably rely on machine translation in this case if it's not a hugely important piece of text, but it is always a good idea to have a process called post-editing. So post-editing is a process in which you process the text using a machine translation model such as Google Translate or maybe ChatGPT. This is a large language model. And then you would ask a human translator to just take a very quick look to make sure that there's no severe error in translation, so that you can get the right message across, but you are not really concerned with finding the perfect word for every single sentence and finding the perfect words and expressions to best convey your sense, because this is just for communication for general purposes. So this type of translation you might get away with using machine translation or AI models plus a very light post-editing process. And then you have text that requires publishing but not marketing. For example, you might have terms and conditions that require translation into a different language. You might have different aspects of your website that's not necessarily for marketing purposes, but for informing. But for the purpose of informing the target readers or your business partners. In this case, you still need a very, very good quality. But again, this is not to sway your customers into buying your product. This is not heavily marketing material. So you can either rely on pure human translation, and I always advocate human translation whenever you can. And please understand that a good translation service is not going to be cheap, so always prioritize human translation. Consider using pure human translation because this is still the best option for you. But if you're thinking about cutting some costs, you can consider machine translation plus a full post-editing. So in the previous example, I mentioned a light post-editing. A light post-editing is just to make sure that the message is correct, is accurately translated, but you're not really concerned with the wording and expressions and your syntax and even your grammar, for example. But in full post-editing, you still want the best possible quality after machine translation, meaning that you still process the text using machine translation and ChatGPT or other AI models, but then you hire a human translator to really make sure that your sentences, your text, your paragraphs flow naturally, and then you achieve the best possible quality. But understand that in this scenario, the post-editors are not going to rewrite the machine translation output. They're just going to edit the machine translation output to the best way they can, and they're not going to work from scratch, but they're going to work on top of what's already been supplied by machine translation or AI models. Again, this is not the ideal option, but this is a good option to consider if you really want to cut some costs and speed up the translation process. And then there is the final type of translation service, which is the most important type of translation service. Let's say you have some text for marketing purposes. For marketing, I would always recommend using human translator and not using machine translation or AI models. Simply for the reason that you are using this text as a powerful tool to encourage, to mobilize, to convince your target customers or consumers to buy your product or use your services. As we all know, words have power. And as we all know, that translation is not a straightforward process. It's not just converting from one language to another language by finding the equivalent pairs of words. This is never a straightforward process. Like I mentioned before, there are lots of cultural sensitivities that you have to consider. You have to consider whether your puns, your humor, your clever design of your source text can be really conveyed into the target language, and then your target audience can really understand what you're trying to achieve with your text. For example, if you have a piece of English text that works really well in the UK market, and then this text has really convinced the consumers in the UK market to buy your product and use your services, you cannot really just simply convert the text using machine translation into another language and expect the customers, the consumers in France or in Spain or in China to just do the same. You would have to hire a localization expert, a human translator with years of experience to really look at every single element of your text to make sure that the text achieves the same effect in the target language. This is not just the meaning, but also the emotional effect, and then you want a piece of text that really touches the soul of your customers to really communicate your culture, your understanding, your mission, your brand, and your message. So for the most important types of translation services, such as marketing text or commercials, you really want a human translators with years of experience, an expert in the field to handle your text. Machine translation is much faster, of course, but it carries huge risks. Machine translation can go wrong in so many different ways, and we have seen so many examples happening almost every day. So you cannot rely on machine translation or AI for these types of text. I'm, of course, not completely against AI in translation services. In the first two examples that I used, I also mentioned that you can use AI, of course, but for the most important type of translation services, my advice is to rely on pure human translation. And then when you deal with a translation agency, the correct term is language service provider in the translation or in the language service industry. When you deal with a language service provider, you have to make sure that they really know what they're doing. A good starting point is to check if the translation agency is ISO certified. The ISO code for language services is ISO 17100. I repeat, ISO 17100. So it's useful to check if they are ISO 17100 certified. And then you also probably want to check if the company is part of a translation association. So in the UK, the most popular associations include the ITI, so this is the Institute of Translators and Institute for Translation and Interpreting, excuse me. And then there is CIOL, Chartered Institute of Linguists. So if they are a member of CIOL or ITI, there's also an association called the ATC, so Association of Translation Companies. So these are the associations that really provide a platform for all these language service providers to get together and then establish industry standards, protect the translators' rights, promote the effective workflow, best practice in translation services. So it's important to check if they are member of either ITI, ATC, CI, or CIOL if you are looking for a company operating in the UK. In the US, there is the ATA, or American Translators Association. So typically speaking, every country will have such an association for translation companies or translators. This is probably your best starting point to look for translation services. Translation services should not and cannot be cheap. If you are really trying to cut down on costs, I don't think translation is the biggest cost in your workflow, in your project. I have seen many examples. A few years ago, I was invited to interpret at the Shard in London. So I offered them my quote for a 3-day conference. It is not much by their standards, really, given the scale and the level of that conference. But they found me really expensive because I am based in Leeds, and then when they thought of the fact that they have to cover my travel costs and my accommodation in London and my interpreting fees, they decided to not go with me. But to be honest, my services are not that expensive. But later on, I heard from the interpreters who actually ended up working at that conference that they spent tens of thousands of pounds on alcohol only. So surely they can afford an interpreter like me working at the conference. So of course there's nothing wrong with trying to cut down on costs, but really you should not make an example out of translation services, because at the end of the day, you really want to speak to the heart of your target audience, your consumers or your customers. So if you want to maximize your sales, maximize your market presence, I don't think trying to save every penny in translation, interpreting, or localization services is the best idea. So I hope you can get at least something out of my presentation. I really encourage this kind of dialogue between the academia, the translation industry, and also, of course, the business world, the end clients who actually use these language services at the end of the day. So thank you all very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you in real life one day. Thank you.